Star Trek books. They've been around for decades. Join us, the Trek Ladies Kavura and Jen, as we discuss the novels one at a time. Welcome to the Ladies Trek Library. Hello, this is Kavura, and I'm here with Jen, and this is Ladies Trek Library. How are you, Jen?
Hey, I'm doing good, Kavura. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So our book for this month is The Autobiography of Jean-Luc Picard, the story of one of Starfleet's most inspirational captains, and it says edited by David A. Goodman. This is a hardcover book, and I'll just read what's on the inside cover. The Autobiography of Jean-Luc Picard tells the story of one of the most celebrated names in Starfleet history. His extraordinary life and career makes for dramatic reading. Court-martials, unrequited love, his capture and torture at the hands of the Cardassians, his assimilation with the Borg, and countless other encounters make Jean-Luc Picard's tale a truly unforgettable one. Picard's logs and excerpts from his personal correspondences give Picard's narrative further depth, and an 8-page color section highlights some of the key moments and relationships from his life. So this is an autobiography, so it's not exactly written the way a novel was. What do you think about like the structure of this book?
Yeah, so I had read David A. Goodman's book, The Autobiography of James T. Kirk, which came out before this one, which is the same format. So it's basically a first-person point of view narrative, starting in this case with Picard as a child, and going chronologically through his life until the Enterprise and beyond. So definitely a different format, but I think it works pretty well.
I mean, it is the way an autobiography is usually written, because I didn't read the one for Kirk, but because I've read autobiographies, the way it just goes from one thing to the next. It's, not a continuous story like a novel. And the way it has editor's footnotes, that was pretty neat. That kind of made it more realistic, didn't it?
Yeah, the editor's footnotes were a little funny at times, pointing out some things that Picard had, some erroneous things that he had said or things that he didn't remember correctly. So that was funny. And a funny story about, well, not this book in particular, but the Autobiography of James T. Kirk is at my local library. And I don't know if the librarian did this on purpose to be funny, or whoever was doing the cataloging really didn't know anything about Star Trek. But it's actually, when I went to get the book, it's filed in the autobiography section with the author being Kirk, not in the science fiction section with David A. Goodman being the author. So,
but because if they didn't know Star Trek, I guess they were going by what it says on the book, because the book does say edited by instead of written by David A. Goodman. Yeah. So it could have been, I don't know, or it could have been someone who was a Star Trek fan that was just sort of trying to, keep the fantasy going, I guess. So,
but yeah, I think the format worked well for this book, and I think the author really captured Picard's voice very well. So I was really happy with it. And having read the Kirk one, I also thought he did a good job capturing Kirk, and I wondered, would he be able to change voices to do Picard so well, being that he's totally different character than Kirk, and I think he did. I think he did a great job with it.
I do too. I do think that I could hear Picard in this. So, and what do you think about like some of the best scenes in this book? Because it kind of went from scene to scene, telling a little bit happened here and there.
Yeah. Well, so the majority of the book is Picard's time prior to being on the Enterprise D, because he was in his late 40s, early 50s, when he took command of the Enterprise D. So the majority of his life was actually before that. So what I liked was the parts of the book, which actually was probably like 2/3 of it, prior to being on the Enterprise, when it really has a narrative flow. So it's, these are stories that we haven't heard. In a couple instances, he might have pulled a little from an episode here or there where, Picard talked about his brother or an incident on the Stargazer. But by and large, they're all unique, new stories, and it follows a narrative. So you feel like you're, right there along with Picard experiencing all these things. And I really couldn't pick one scene that was my favorite. I would just say the entire portion up to the time on the Enterprise D was kind of like my favorite part of the book, because there were so many good scenes throughout his life, from the time he was a child, aspiring to be a captain, to Starfleet Academy, to the first ship that he was on, which I already forgot the name of. I should have written it down. The ship that he was briefly on, and then the Stargazer. Just so many good.
Yeah, I think it was Reliant. I mean, I had it written down, but yeah.
What about you? Did you have any favorite scenes?
There was, I mean, like I know one thing that stuck out to me was when he went to Spock's wedding. I mean, okay, so on the show they did say that Picard went to Sarek's son's wedding. So what happened here was, Picard was a young ensign or a cadet. I think it was right at that time when he was just finishing up the academy. When he went to the wedding and he couldn't see who Spock was marrying, I think he knew that it was a human, but she was wearing a veil. And when the person that was officiating the wedding said that the name of the woman that Spock was marrying, and Picard couldn't hear the name because someone coughed, I just thought that was hilarious. I mean, so that's how the author got away with not saying who Spock married, because that would have just caused ripples in fandom, I guess.
Yeah, that was actually really funny, and I loved how he got around that issue. And I listened to an interview with the author about this book, and one thing he said was, because, in some of the novel verses, Spock has married Saavik, and he said that he specifically chose a human because he felt like Picard, having mentioned that he was at the wedding, that he didn't feel that there would be Starfleet guests at a Vulcan wedding. We've seen what a Vulcan wedding is. It's not like usually a ceremony like we have on Earth where, it's open to a lot of people in public. So he felt like it must have been a human woman. So that's why he went with that. So I thought that was an interesting choice. And also how he, conveniently has her face hidden. So we don't know who she is.
Yeah, but then you still have to think that Picard would have gone back later and looked it up in Starfleet Records or something. But it is good the way he handled it in this book.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't think of that at the time. He probably went back and looked it up. But... Yeah.
Because that's what we would do now. We would just Google it. But yeah. And another thing I thought was interesting was Picard's first assignment. Once he finished the academy, this book said he was, well, of course we know he had the incident with the Nausicaan, so he had the artificial heart. And it says because of that, he didn't get to go on the ship that he had originally been assigned to, because they had to leave without him. They couldn't wait for all of his recovery time. So Picard became a science officer, a junior science officer on a ship. So basically he was like the alternate timeline in the episode Tapestry, where Picard didn't have the incident with the Nausicaan and he became a science officer. But in that reality, he stayed a science officer and never became a captain. But I just thought it was interesting that even in this, what we call the correct timeline, he still started off as a science officer. It's just that he rose up quickly because he was such a good officer.
Yeah, and it was interesting, too, because he wasn't supposed to be on the Reliant. He was supposed to be on, was it the Enterprise C? Or he was supposed to be on another ship, but because of the incident with the Nausicaans, he ended up, being injured and recovering for a month or two, and he missed his opportunity to be on the other ship. So then he had to take the Reliant, was kind of like the only job he could find at that point. So it wasn't his first choice, but ended up, working out to be something good for him.
And another interesting thing was, so in the book he does marry Beverly Crusher. And what was cute, though, was we find out he invited Q to the wedding, And Q actually came, but did not make a scene at the wedding. Can you believe that?
Yeah, that was another great scene. Q in disguise at the wedding. That was pretty cool. I know there's been another, and I never read it, Q or Cordially Invited, which is supposed to be about Picard and Beverly's wedding, but I haven't read that one, so I don't know, if it has any similarities.
Right. Yeah, I didn't read that one, but I hope to sometime. I used to read all the Q books. I just didn't get to that one. And how cute, and the introduction to this book was supposed to have been written by Beverly, but you saw how it got interrupted by Q, and that was funny too.
Yeah, well, I will say one thing about the introduction, and overall, I really liked this book a lot. I really thought it was very good, but there were like 3 issues I had with it. One being the introduction with Beverly. I don't know, to me, it didn't feel like her words. It seemed kind of overly sappy and not something I felt like Beverly was saying. But it was pretty short, and as you said, Q interrupts it, calling it drivel. So that was pretty funny. I also thought, just because we're talking about Beverly, it seemed like in the book they made her a lot younger than she was on the show. Now, I mean, I know on the show that she was younger than Picard, but it seemed like they made her like significantly younger than him than she is in canon. And same thing with Troy. So that was just one sort of thing that I noticed, that the ages didn't seem to line up, but that was pretty minor.
Okay. Yeah, that was interesting. No, I didn't really think about that. But yeah, Picard rose through the ranks pretty quickly, right? But yeah, the fact that he was already of command rank while these other people were still just starting out. You are right. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, because in this book, when Picard first meets Beverly, he meets her through Jack Crusher, who's on his ship, the Stargazer, and Jack is, dating Beverly, and Jack appears from the book to be in his early 20s, maybe mid 20s, and Beverly is still at the academy, so she's, even younger than Jack, so it just seemed a little odd to me, but I did like how, it showed how Picard and Beverly and Jack Crusher all, became friends and their early relationship.
I did like that. I mean, yeah, because that's something that you would have expected in this book, but I do think that it was handled very well, the way their relationships and how they became friends, and Picard, falling in love with Beverly, because we know that happened. And yes, that was written very well.
Well, do we want to move into the worst scenes in it? Or do we have more best ones I want to talk about?
No, that's it. What did you want to say for worst?
Well, I didn't think that there was necessarily a worst scene, but I felt that this book kind of struggled in the same way that the James T. Kirk autobiography did, in that once it caught up to where when Picard's on the Enterprise D, which is what we had seen on the show, the narrative became very choppy, because it was no longer a flowing narrative of him telling the story of what's happening for someone who doesn't know what's happening. It kind of assumed at that point that the reader had seen all of these episodes, and not just seen them, but for many of these episodes I haven't seen them in a long time, so I maybe didn't remember all of the details, but it just felt very choppy, where it would just be like, oh, here's some bonus material to this TNG episode, and give a few paragraphs about what happened in Picard's mind or behind the scenes, and the narrative didn't flow anymore as a narrative. It was just kind of like little snippets added on to episodes that the author presumed that the reader had seen. So that, to me, I felt like even if the reader has seen these things, I don't think anyone would have minded, having a more complete narrative where he summarizes a little bit more about what's happening and on the episode, and then adds in the extra stuff instead of it just moving, oh, and then this happened, and you're supposed to know what's going on. Because a couple of times I did have to go and look on Memory Alpha, because I was like, oh, I don't, it's been a long time since I've seen that episode. I don't remember exactly, what happened or all the specific details. That was really my only issue with the book, was that part of it, which only was maybe about a third or a fourth of the book, so it wasn't, it was just not the majority of it, but I just felt like it could have been done better.
Okay, I mean that is how I felt too. When the book once it got up to Picard being in command of the Enterprise, we pretty much know what happened, and so the book kind of went, a paragraph here about the Borg and a paragraph there. What the author could have done was describe something in more detail from Picard's point of view and telling more things that we didn't know about that episode. But he chose not to do that. So all we got was a summary of the episodes, almost.
Yeah, I agree. He did give a little snippets of what Picard felt, but it just felt very choppy and, just not as well done or flowing as well as the earlier chapters.
So, and then the next part is how do you think this fits into canon? I mean, I think it fit pretty well with the things that were already established about Picard.
Yeah, I think it fit as far as, canon, being just stuff on screen. It fit very well. I thought he, did an excellent job filling in the background based on just small snippets that we've got, especially about Picard's early life, with his brother. We really only had the one episode, maybe the second one, where we, get a insight into their relationship. And it all felt very Picard, and it all felt believable in that it fit in with the canon well.
I think it did fit in well. And talking about his brother, like when Picard and his brother were young and their parents were there. And since we don't really know what his parents look like, except for, one episode showed an image of his mother, but it was when she was much older. I pictured, in this book, when Picard's father was there, I pictured Picard looking like Picard's brother Robert, and I pictured Picard's mother looking like, Robert's wife Marie. Did you do that, or was that just me?
No, I didn't. I kind of tried to imagine Robert as younger, but I didn't really, when I was reading the parts about his parents, I kind of didn't have any image in my mind of what they looked like.
Okay. Yeah, for some reason I just had to picture them as characters that I had already seen that were Picard's family. But one thing I did notice that contradicted canon was just the uniforms, because they described the uniforms, and also there's the pictures in the middle of the book. But on the show, Jack Crusher actually wore the Monster Maroon uniform instead of the TNG jumpsuit from first and second seasons. And the book seems to think that they wore the TNG uniforms back then. So that's the only thing I really noticed. I mean, and that's minor, but And
that is very perceptive of you, because I'm looking at that picture right now, and it had never even occurred to me, but you're totally right.
Yeah, and maybe he just did that on purpose. I don't know, but the pictures were great. I mean, they had pictures in the middle of the book, which I was not expecting, because I didn't read that inside cover until just now. But yeah, the picture of Picard and his brother when they were kids, and then the picture of the older Picard and Picard with Samuel Clemens. All of those were great pictures. Oh, and the wedding invitation, it had a picture of Picard and Beverly's wedding invitation.
Yeah, and the there's a flyer for Shadows of Catan, an evening of music and discourse with Captain Jean-Luc Picard in 10-4, where he's playing I don't know what the instrument is called, the recorder that he plays in that episode. The inner light.
The flute. I called it a flute, right? But yeah, that was great too. Yes. I mean, and the reference to that story in the book was good too, talking about Catan.
Oh, well, I do want to go back, because I just thought of something. I think I do have a favorite scene that just occurred to me now as I was flipping through the book, and I was reminded of it.
Okay.
And looking at the picture of Picard with Samuel Clemens is what made me think of it. Just the scene where he meets Guinan for the first time. And she recognizes him because, of course, for her, they had met several hundred years prior when he travels back in time. But for him, that hasn't happened yet. And so he says, "Oh, do we know each other?" And she says, "No, but we will." So that was really neat how they, how he got to meet Guinan. That was a good section, I thought.
Yeah, that was good, and that was interesting the way they met too. About her husband had just died, and he had to go see her. And that does make me think of something else about this book. The way so in Picard's early years, he worked with these people in Starfleet who weren't really the best officers and almost didn't care either. I mean, it was an interesting aspect of Starfleet that we don't get to see on the show.
Yeah, that was a neat scene, and I kind of knew it was going to be. I just had a feeling. He goes down, and his crew member has died, or his captain has died, and he has to deliver the news to the captain's ex-wife, who is the person named in the will, and he goes down, and I just had a feeling, and it was Guinan, and so that was a pretty great scene. And then, there are other scenes in the book where they cross paths again. Guinan is tending bar, and it sort of all comes together. How she eventually ends up tending bar at 10 Forward. So the scenes with her throughout the book were very good, I thought.
And so, how does this fit into other novels? Because I know there are other novels that have mentioned Picard, or even, like the way Kirk's autobiography was structured. I do know that I just read The Buried Age, which was another Picard prequel, and that book had it started with the Battle of Maxia and has the story up until Picard took command of the Enterprise. So it paralleled some of the years of Picard's life that were in this book, but it was really a very different story. It said something completely different happened. I mean, since The Buried Age, I guess, was a separate novel, it had to be it had this story involving Picard that was very epic and, a save the galaxy kind of thing, which doesn't happen in this book during those years. But, how do you feel this book fits in with other novels?
Yeah, well, in that, I had realized it myself just from the research that I had been doing, but in the interview that I heard with the author, he did say that I don't think he's read most of the novels in the novelverse. I mean, he's only written this book and the autobiography of James T. Kirk, so he's not like a regular novel writer. So I don't think he's read most of the novels. And he just said he just put his own slant on it, that he wasn't, he knew other people had touched on some of the stories, but he focused on what was on screen only. I have not read the Stargazer series. But I mean, I know from the research that I've done, it totally contradicts Stargazer. And there were a couple other scenes in there and I can't think of specific books, but there were a couple of times where I was like, oh yeah, this is totally different than in the novelverse, especially with his relationship with Beverly. Although they do marry in the novelverse, the whole relationship is very different than it was in this book.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, I do know that in the comic books, so the scene in this book where they had Picard becoming an ambassador, he goes to Vulcan, that was actually in the comics. And what I understand is that was in a comic called, a series called Countdown, which had the events leading up to the 2009 movie. And that actually was declared canon, which I think is why it was in this book. So there actually is part of that that's like, like one of the comic book series they decided to make canon, and he put it in this book to have it part of Picard's life. I just thought that was interesting.
Oh, see, I wasn't aware of that because I have not read any of the comics at all, so I'm not familiar with all the, stuff happening there. So that's interesting. I have to listen to the interview again, but I don't recall him saying anything about the comics, but could be that he'd read them. I mean, obviously it doesn't take long to read those compared to reading the whole novelverse, so that's interesting.
Yeah, or maybe they told him to put it in or something, I don't know.
Yeah, that could be. Could be that he was told to put it in. I know he mentioned there's like a brief scene that's has to do with the
with Discovery. There's something like really, and I can't even remember what it was. It was like really tiny, and I was like, oh, kind of something that has to do with Discovery. I think it might have been about the holograms. How they had holograms for communication instead of just the view screen. So he's obviously seen Discovery, but of course, since that doesn't really follow Picard, but maybe he included not just that, but some of the comics. I'll have to listen to that again and see.
Okay. So what did you think about, so we can go ahead and give away spoilers, what about the end and Picard being alone at the end?
Yeah, that was kind of interesting. Because Beverly and Picard do get married, as in the novel verse, but it's very different because Beverly becomes captain of another ship, and while Picard becomes an ambassador to Vulcan, it went right after their first marriage, so they're not living together. They only have, I think it mentions at some point that they only see each other, maybe a few times over a few years, and then he retires to his vineyard on Earth, and Beverly's still, on her ship. So it's kind of the last sentence of the book is, for me, I'm happy making my father's wine. So he seems to be content, but it was a bit sad to see that, two people who spent so long, we're waiting for so long for them to get together, and then they get married and they're not really together. It seemed kind of sad.
It does. I do think Beverly should have been with him in the end. The thing is, she's a doctor, so it just, and in real life, we know doctors who still work past retirement age. So it just seems like Beverly could have come back to Earth and still have her own practice on Earth. And the book does mention that with transporters, they can go anywhere, anytime. So she could set up an office anywhere and still come back to Picard, every night so they could be together. That's what it seems like.
Yeah, and a lot of Star Trek, I think, is guilty of this, in that they always want to make the characters moving up in rank, even when it doesn't necessarily make sense. And my parents have two good friends they're now retired, but they were both doctors in the Navy, and I think they both got to the rank of something around captain. They were officers, but as doctors, they don't ever command a ship. It doesn't make sense. You're not a doctor in command of a ship. That's a totally different job, right? So in the same way that the commander of the ship isn't a doctor. So it was a little odd that they kind of, and they did that in TNG a bit with Deanna Troi, like, oh, she's wanting to take more command duties, and I'm kind of like, oh, maybe I could see it, but, she's a counselor, and then another thing they did was how they had made, and this was a little more logical, but still when they made Christine Chapel, she went from being a nurse to a doctor, and I guess because people think, oh, people got to keep moving up, even though it doesn't really make sense to me that, I have nurses in my family. If you want to be a doctor, you study to be a doctor. If you want to be a nurse, I don't know nurses who start out as a nurse and then, oh, I'm going to keep moving up and become a doctor. It's not impossible, but they're different things.
Right. It's a different career path. You're right. Yeah. People don't usually use nursing as a stepping stone to becoming a doctor. Yeah, that's right. But for Picard, it's also interesting in this book that you see how he went full circle. He came back to working the vineyards. And I guess the author got that idea because in the last episode, All Good Things, in the future, which is sort of a projected future that's not necessarily what is going to happen, but in the future, Picard was working in the vineyard. So I guess he got the idea from that. And I kind of justify it in my mind by saying, well, at this point, Picard was 90. He was old, and he was probably, he was tired of command, but he still wanted to do something. If he was still able to use his body to make the wine, then that was something that at least kept him occupied. And so he was satisfied doing it in his old age because he didn't really want to, gallivant across the galaxy anymore.
Yeah, it's plausible, I guess, at that point because he's, he's that old. But like you said, it did seem odd that Beverly was still off commanding her ship while her husband's alone on Earth. It's just a little sad. And I guess they're gonna. I know that's some that want to talk about that too. But at least the part about the Vineyard looks like, from what we've seen, that's going to be happening in the new Picard show. Although it seems like it'll be happening when he's much younger than he is in this book.
Yeah, if you want to talk about that now, I did notice that in the trailer that they showed the Vineyard, but it was really just, I think it was one scene, so we don't really know if a Picard is going to stay in the Vineyard during that whole Picard series.
Well, I saw in the trailer where apparently, he's retired and, Seven of Nine comes to try to convince him to take command of the ship again. And at least for that series, we'll see how it is when it comes out. I did feel like, wow, he's, because in the book, by the time he retires in the Vineyard, as you said, he's like in his 90s. But in the Picard series, he won't be that old. So it did seem a little odd to me in the series that he may have already retired to the Vineyard. Since, I don't know, I guess I just never thought of that as something that he wanted to do, especially that young. But
well, right, especially because the book said he didn't want to do it. When he was younger, he never wanted to do what his father and his brother did, but he had to when he was a child, and he, to him it was a chore. It was really something he didn't want to do. But yeah, as we get older, we do find we have other interests and things like that. Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how that part of this, how the Picard series, if it in any way is similar to, this book as far as what happens to Picard after Nemesis and all that, since we don't have that on screen in canon. I don't think the author had any, because that show wasn't in the works when he wrote this book for a couple of years. So.
Yeah, this was written, I think it came out in 2018. But yeah, because, and it's another thought that, how the autobiography of Spock was supposed to be released this year, but they put it off. And we have to think that they're rewriting it because of all the stuff that was added to Spock's character on Discovery. And so that had to happen with Spock, but the timing for this book, it came out before they knew they were going to make the Picard series, or else this book might have been put off another year or two because of the Picard series.
Yeah, so a lot of it may be made non-canon, and he may have to rewrite it.
Oh no, terrible. And yeah, they'll say this was about an alternate universe Picard or something.
Well, the novels aren't canon, so,
That's true, too.
Okay. But, not related to this book in particular, but from what we've seen just of the trailer, and the little notes that I've seen for the Picard series, it seems like he's not with Beverly. And that does make me a little sad, because we've gotten used to that in the novel universe. And on the show we knew that they were in love with each other, so I guess we'll just have to see. I'm pretty sure Gates McFadden, we haven't heard anything that she's coming back, so it doesn't sound like she's going to be a part of it.
Yeah, we haven't heard that she's coming back, even though we've heard some of the other people are going to be on it. So, yeah, and they probably will mention her. They probably will say what happened to her. And it's probably just that she's, head of Starfleet Medical or something like that.
Yeah.
So, overall thoughts about this book. Well, I do want to say that I like the author's, his own, writing credits. He wrote for Golden Girls, which is funny. We both like that show. I know we've mentioned that. And he wrote for The Simpsons, well, no, not The Simpsons, Family Guy and American Dad. And he said that he said that due to Seth MacFarlane, he got to meet Patrick Stewart. I just thought that was interesting. I know how it must have happened, because that show American Dad was a Seth MacFarlane cartoon, and I used to love American Dad. Patrick Stewart did you may already know this, but he did a voice on it. It was recurring, but he played the head of the CIA, and they actually made his character look like Patrick Stewart. He was wearing a suit, so he didn't look like Picard, but he looked like Patrick Stewart, and he was just, he was really great on that show. Anyway, so I think this writer is obviously a good writer because he's done some good shows.
Yeah, and I know I've read that he did the Star Trek episode for Futurama, which I have not seen, but my friend who's a Star Trek fan has been like nagging me for years. You have to watch this episode, and I still haven't gotten around to it.
Oh yeah, Futurama's good.
Have you seen it?
Yeah, Futurama actually had several episodes where they referred to Star Trek, so I'm not sure yet exactly which episode this is, but I probably did see it.
I think it was one where there was like the heads of the different Starfleet captains.
Okay. Well, having heads on Futurama was also a common thing, but but yeah, having a head of Leonard Nimoy, that was pretty good too. They did that, but yeah, Futurama was a funny show. And it's interesting that this writer has written so much, he's written comedy TV shows. And this book, it wasn't, it had funny stuff in it, but it was not a comical book.
Yeah, it did have, as you mentioned, not a comedy, but it did have some humorous moments in there. And I agree. I think it was a really good book. The flow was really good. If I had had the time, I could have sat down and just read it straight through because the story just kept me interested. And as I mentioned before, I think he captured Picard's voice so well.
I do think he knew Picard pretty well. I think he got all of that right. So overall, we both thought it was a good book, right? It's worth reading.
Yeah, it's definitely worth reading. I know that it may contradict some of the novel verse, so that might disappoint some people, especially the section on the Stargazer is a pretty long section. But I think it was so well done, and how it sets up how he meets all of the people who will later serve with him on the Enterprise. So that was really neat. He briefly meets Troy and LaForge and Worf, and so those were all little neat things. So definitely recommend for TNG fans. It's a really great read.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.